This year, we're going to call it the world's most perfected human being. And it's a story, it's an analysis of Moshe Rabbenu. And with Moshe, there's a tremendous amount to analyze. But what made Moshe Rabbenu Moshe Rabbenu? What developed him? Why did God choose him? We're going to start out with a number of topics, but the first is the old question, and we ask this about every human being. Is it nurture or is it nature? I'll tell you as a parent, you think that you're such a smart, wise parent, and then you realize, to a certain degree you have very little to do with some of the things that come out in terms of your children, in terms of who they are, their nature, their character. On the other hand, we know the role that nurture has. So with Moshe Rabbenu, what was it? Was it nurture or nature? Well, you have this description of him as a child. It says, they saw the child, ki tovhu, that he was good. And obviously that bothers everyone. Every child is good. I mean, think about it. Children, they spit up, they make from the other end, they're crying, they have to be taken care of, they're totally dependent, but we love children. There's a certain, inkling we have towards little babies, towards infants. There's no such thing as an ugly baby. They could be the ugliest baby, but they're cute, they're wonderful, etc. What do you mean, ki tovhu? So the Mefarshim jump on that term. I'll give you an example. Some of the Mefarshim say nolad mahul, based on a medrash. What does it mean that he was born circumcised? He was born without a foreskin. That's a symptom. That's not a cause. It's a symptom of the fact that he was born in a perfected way, meaning biochemically, his biochemical makeup was a very healthy one. His IQ was a superior IQ. Very often you find children with superior IQ, and it has an effect on them emotionally. They're challenged emotionally as a function of the fact that they can't function. They don't go through normal developmental stages emotionally. And that was Moshe Rabbenu. He was nolad mahul ki tovhu. He was born in a perfected way. But at the same time, what are we told about Moshe? We're told a lot about his nurture. Not just his nature, but his nurture. There were three women in particular, and of course his father, that had a major influence on his life. Who were the three women, so to speak, the three women that influenced Moshe Rabbenu? His sister, Miriam, and we'll get into Miriam. His mother, of course, Yocheved. And his stepmother, Batya, the royal princess, the Egyptian royal princess, the woman that we call Batya. Batya literally means the daughter of God. Of course, that's not what she was referred to in Mitzrayim, but that's what we call her. And what kind of insight will this give us into who Moses was? Well, let's start out with his sister. You had a world, and we can relate to this because many children were never born in the 1930s and the 1940s because their parents made a decision. Who is going to bring a child into this world where a child can't survive? Well, it was that way in Mitzrayim. Who wants to have children? There was no sophisticated means of birth control at that time. So what did they do? Yocheved and Amram, Moshe's parents, they separated. They separated because that way they wouldn't have a child who would be slaughtered, who would be butchered by the Egyptians. And of course, Miriam, who at that time was maybe a young adolescent, 9, 10 years old, she comes to her parents and she says the following: Father, mother, with respect, she says, your decree, gzeirascha kasha miparos. Your decree is more severe than the Pharaoh's. The Pharaoh's not killing Jewish girls, he's just killing Jewish boys. By you not bringing children into the world, you're putting an end to our nation, an end to our people. There will no longer be a Jewish people. And Amram and Yocheved, they thought long and hard about their daughter's challenge, about their daughter's feelings and her concerns. And in a public way, they came back together. Vayikach, right? What is Vayikach? It's always the terminology for marriage. There was a public reestablishment of Amram and Yocheved living together, of remarrying, so to speak. And others followed their lead. And to a great degree, the beginning of our redemption, the beginning of the Geula was what? The fact that Jews could look and try to build for a better tomorrow. The Jews could look into the future and look past the pain and the misery of the present and want to bring a tomorrow, bring a future to the Jewish people. And in this sense, Miriam has a vested interest in this child from even before his inception. Of course, Yocheved. We have a tradition that the miyaldos ivrios, right, the midwives were who? They were Yocheved and Miriam. What's the idea? Yocheved was someone who not only cared and was concerned for the Jewish people, but she was actively engaged in saving Jewish children and saving Jewish lives. And now that she would have a child of her own, another child, after thinking that that was it, no more children, what she invested in this child. She was a woman of great substance. And then, of course, is the Batya, the Egyptian royal princess. The toughest, most feared man on the face of the earth, the Pharaoh, who no one would defy. No one would defy him. He has this absolute power. And who defies him? His adolescent daughter. I mean, we can laugh at it. You know, you're feared by far and near, by men and women. You're feared by everyone, except for who? Your own adolescent daughter. And she challenges her father. And there's something special about her. This act of defiance, and if you look at the commentaries, she even defies her own servants who are against her doing this. And she takes this child and she raises this child. He becomes the Prince of Egypt. This Jewish baby, most unlikely of all circumstances, of all scenarios, and this Jewish baby, because of the act of defiance of the royal princess, she's going to raise him, and he becomes the Prince of Egypt. So it's interesting, and the Ibn Ezra points this out. He doesn't live, he's not raised amongst the Jews. He's raised as an aristocrat. He's raised as royalty, as a leader. And it's these character traits and qualities that are a function of his nurture. His nurture, in this case, not from his mother or sister or father, but his nurture from his stepmother, that enables him to have the abilities that he has, to have these abilities that he will employ later in life in different stages. One thing that's fascinating, there's a common denominator that you find vis-a-vis his sister Miriam, vis-a-vis his parents coming together, vis-a-vis his stepmother Batya. And what is that? The common denominator is that they are all willing to buck the tide. They're all willing to stand up in the face of oppression and tyranny. They're all willing to stand up for that which is right, that which is moral, and to look past the tyranny and oppression, to look beyond that and build for a better future and a better tomorrow. And that's something that's embedded in him from literally his inception. It's embedded in him from his youngest years. And it's something that he takes and he implants in the Jewish people. What we see, in the Ibn Ezra makes this point as well. Look at his confrontations. So the first is Vayar B'Sivlosam. The Prince of Egypt had no reason to want to leave the royal palace, leave the life of comfort, of luxury, of education, and do what? Vayar B'Sivlosam. To go into the suburbs, to go into the slums, to go into the neighborhoods where only the slaves are allowed, and to see how they suffer, to see what they're going through. And what happens? He encounters a scenario through providence where an Egyptian taskmaster has an inkling, a yearning, a desire for a Jewish woman. He sends out the slave, the Jewish husband, out on a task, and it's dark. There's no electricity, obviously, in antiquities. He comes in, she assumes it's her husband, and he violates this Jewish woman. The slave, the husband of the Jewish woman, comes back and sees what? Sees a taskmaster with his wife. The taskmaster, who doesn't want word to get out what he's doing with a Jewish woman, doesn't want the slave to, he starts beating the slave to death. And Moshe encounters this. What does Moshe do? It says, Vayifen ko vako, vayarki ein ish. Let's repeat that. Vayifen ko vako. He looks here, he looks there. But it doesn't say po vasham. It doesn't say he looks here and there. Ko vako. Ko is always the term of Jewish destiny. We bring this up in the 13th of the Kinos, on Tisha B'Av. The term ko. Ko amar Hashem. It's always a term of Jewish destiny. Ko yiyeh zaracha. And what happens? Moshe does what? Moshe says, look, I could rationalize, I could justify. Let the innocent slave be beat to death. Let the innocent Jew die. If I do nothing, if I stay here, so to speak, in the shadows, no one will know I was here. They won't know I was here. And you know what? In 10, in 20 years, when I go from being the prince of Egypt to the next Pharaoh, when I go from being the prince of Egypt to a position where I can actually have control, I can save the lives and the quality of lives of thousands and tens of thousands of Jews. But if I get involved in this incident and I kill the Egyptian to save the life of the innocent slave, to save the life of Nebuch, this wretched slave who's suffering under the hands of the taskmaster, that'll be it. There'll be no saving of hundreds of thousands of tens of thousands of Jews down the road in the future. So what does he do? What does Moshe do? Vayifen ko vako. He looked into his future, into what does a moral human being do? And despite all the justifications and rationalizations, he acts. He engages in an action to save a man he's never met, a man he probably never will meet in the future. And he saves the life of this innocent. And unfortunately, as you know, no good deed goes unpunished. Unfortunately, no good deed goes unpunished. And who, so to speak, is the Malshan, is the Moser? Who rats out what the Prince of Egypt has done, what Moshe has done? It's the Jews. The same Jews that he's reached out, that he's tried to save, that he's tried to make their plight that much better, that much easier. Nebuch. It's a tragedy. And Moshe responds, says something very fascinating. Because what was the first incident? It was saving an innocent slave from a taskmaster. The second incident is he sees two Jews fighting, one with the other. And he tries to make shalom and break up their fight. And what does he do? He says, now I know. Achein noda hadavar. Achein noda hadavar. So Rashi says two things. He says, what's the pshat? Therefore, the matter is known. What's the matter that's become known? Meaning that I killed an Egyptian. I killed a governmental official. I turned on a governmental official. This biological Jew, who's been raised as an Egyptian, who hopefully has been brought up to think and to function like Egyptian, is killed an Egyptian for the sake of another Jew. That's the simple pshat. Then Rashi quotes, it's a medrash, it's a Gemara in Sota. What's achein noda davar? The matter, not the matter of killing the taskmaster, but what matter, what issue? The issue or the matter that has bothered me my whole life, the issue of theodicy. How could it be? Why is it that these Jewish people are suffering? What did they do? When you look at their morality, when you look at their ethics, when you look at who they are, they're much better than the Egyptians. They're much better than other peoples. Why is it that they suffer? Tzadik viralo, rasha v'tovlo. And why is it that the Egyptians are living such an easy, qualitative life when their morals, when their ethics, when their theology is so corrupt? This matter now I understand. Where do you find something like this? Where I risk my future. I risk everything I've ever been and everything I ever will be to save an innocent slave, and no good deed goes unpunished, and they rat me out? Moshe takes his hands and he throws up his hands. He says, Achein noda davar. Now I understand, now I know what has happened, why they are where they are, why their destiny is the destiny that has befallen them. And he gives up on the Jewish people. He flees, he has no choice. He's now a fugitive, and he has no choice but to flee. And I'm going to take a 30-second digression for why is he called Moshe? This is going back to the princess of Egypt, Batya. He was born a Vigdor. His mother and father did not name him Moshe. He was born a Vigdor. We call him Moshe. Historically, we have this profound gratitude throughout history that min hamayim mishitihu. She took him out. She drew him out of the water. Our gratitude for her act of defiance, for her saving the life of this innocent child, we name him in gratitude. We use the name that she chose for him. That's why we refer to him as Moshe, not as a Vigdor. Going back now, he's the fugitive. He has to flee the country, has to flee for his life. Where does he go? So the Torah doesn't tell us. We find out later in life that he comes to Midian. but we don't know anything. We speak about the Watergate tapes, the missing 18 minutes. Wouldn't we love to know what President Nixon had to say on those missing 18 minutes? Well, what about the missing 45 years in his life? We learn about his birth. We learn about his adolescence. We learn about him as a young adult, as the Prince of Egypt. And then we find nothing. We know nothing until later in life, till he comes to Midian, to Saudi Arabia. What about for that 45-year period? Where was he? What did he do? What became of him? So the Medrash fills us in. It's a fascinating Medrash. It says, well, if you're going to flee Egypt as a fugitive, where would you go? You could go north along the Via Maris to Mesopotamia, but they could get you. That's a small pass. But if you flee south, if you go south, you can go into Kush. It was referred to as the Belgian Congo, Biafra. Today it's the various countries that make up Central Africa. Uganda, Kenya, Eritrea, these countries. He flees south into Kush. Because remember, Mitzrayim is not a small, third world country in North Africa. Mitzrayim was an empire. Probably took up the top third of the Egyptian continent. So he flees into the center of the continent, into Kush. And they find out who he is in Kush. And they realize they have a brilliant leader. They have someone who's been nurtured, who's been developed, who can take their economy, take their society, their civilization, and develop it to a place it's never been. And of course, he does that. And eventually, after helping them in terms of their military, their economy, social issues in their society, he eventually becomes the leader of Kush, becomes the prime minister. And what's interesting about that midrash, we know that many midrashim are not taken literally. I think this is a medrash that could be taken literally. And I want to explain what I mean by that. Why is it that there's not one word in the Torah about what happens during those 45 years? Why is it that, if the Torah can tell us what Moshe is doing, but I apologize, if the Torah chooses not to teach us and not to tell us, now what? The Medrash is going to fill us in? You know more than the Ribono Shel Olam? What God chose not to write about, not to discuss, you're going to tell us? What's the Medrash doing? And I want to ask a more basic question, leaving aside the Medrash and the absence in the Torah. If Moshe played this role in the Belgian Congo, in Biafra, if he played this important, crucial role, there's not one historical record of Moshe playing this role. There's a huge historical material on Moshe as the leader of the Jews, but we don't know anything of this period. And by the way, this was the height of his life. This was Moshe as a young man, as a middle-aged man. The Moshe that we know is an older. He's already in his late 70s. He becomes the leader of the Jews as an 80-year-old. This was during the prime of his life. And we don't know one word of it. Not historically, not otherwise. How come? So this idea I heard from Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblatt, the rabbi of the RJC. He felt the following. The reason it's not in the Torah, that we understand. Because in terms of the ultimate role in shaping the nation, the Jewish nation, the role that he had in terms of shaping the destiny of humanity, these years are not significant. They don't play a role in terms of their impact on humanity, on civilization, on the transformation ethically and morally, the transformation theologically of the history either of Am Yisrael or of humanity. So that we understand why it's not in the Torah. What's the point of the Medrash? The Medrash is teaching us the following. The constant between Cush and between the Jews was Moshe. This great, sensitive, sincere, dynamic leader who really had an impact in changing the quality and the quantity of lives. That was a constant. What was the variable? Why is it that his impact on the Jews, which ultimately would shape the future of all of civilization, that's something which is known, which is, it's irrevocable what he's done to impact the of humanity. But on the other hand, his impact on Cush long term seems to be zero. For sure, his impact on Cush vis-a-vis the rest of humanity was zero. What changed? Moshe was the constant. What changed? The variable, so to speak, was not Moshe. As we said, he was the constant. The variable was the Torah. Moshe's legacy is Torah's Moshe. You want to call it the doctrine, the theology, the system, the methodology that God gave us. that long after Moshe's death, and long after the death of those who were his students, of those who interacted with him, of those who were influenced by him, Moshe would leave us a legacy that would define us, would shape us, would imprint itself on us. And that legacy, that destiny, of course, is what? The system of the Torah. Torah's Moshe. And that's why Moshe is Chai V'Kayim. Whereas in Cush, after he leaves, so a generation, 2, 3, 4 generations, there's no one alive who knew Moshe, alive who was impacted by Moshe. And governments change, leadership changes, administrations change. And ultimately, his long-term impact, in the end, is nil. That's the difference. And that's what the Midrash is teaching us. That's the insight the Midrash is giving us. So Moshe, later in life, after he's served humanity, served the people of Cush, he now comes to Yisro. And when we say Yisro Kohen Midyan, Kohen, if you look at the Rishonim, they describe it's a person of significance, of substance. See, one explanation of Kohen could be he was the archbishop of Midyan. The other explanation of Kohen is not just the archbishop, but what? But he was what? He was a position of he was a member of the aristocracy, he was a leader. And he had a huge empire, a cattle empire. Remember, at that time in history, there were basically 2 primary sectors to any economy. Crops, what you grow, the wheat, the oats, the corn, the cotton. And then there were animals. Small animals, goats and sheep, large animals, behemoths, gassos, cattle, camels, donkeys, etc., horses. So he was he was a baron. He was the Kohen Midyan. He had a huge empire. And who was the CEO of his company? Who was the CEO of his empire? His son-in-law. This great, great leader. This person who had been a person who led literally societies and civilizations would be the one who would lead his staff of shepherds, who would lead the tremendous acreage that he had, thousands of square acres, and would run the business. According to some of the commentaries, the reason Moshe goes after the one lost lamb, that little Shepselah, is because he's got other shepherds, maintaining the majority of the flock. So what happens? Moshe Rabbenu, now for decades, he has long been past the Jewish people. The experience that almost cost him his life, the experience that cost him his future, it's decades in the past. And when the Jewish people start to do tshuva, we're now going to go into a short digression for just a minute or so. We're going to quote the Ramban, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. What do they say? That the Jews had been hoping and yearning there would be a change of administration. There would be a new Pharaoh who wouldn't be a megalomaniac, who wouldn't be a psycho, who wouldn't have this obsession with the Jews. In the good old days, they would remember what Joseph did for the economy and how Joseph made Egypt into the dominant empire on the face of the earth. They would remember how loyal the Jews are and what good citizens the Jews are. That's what they were hoping for. And what happens? Vayamas melech Mitzrayim. The king or the Pharaoh of Egypt dies, and the new Pharaoh comes. There's a new Pharaoh now. He's not an anti-Semite. He's not a megalomaniac. He's not obsessed with the Jews. But he looks at the scenario and he says, hey, my economy runs on free labor. This whole civilization is what it is because we have free labor, slave labor. And I'm not going to give that up. I'm not going to destroy the economy. Things are going way too well for that. And even though he's not a Jew hater, what happens? Same policies as his predecessor. At that point, the Jews give up. They give up all hope. They were hoping, they were yearning, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. What would that light at the end of the tunnel be? The new administration? Forget it. We're going to die as slaves. Our children are going to die as slaves. Forget it. And they can only turn to one place. They cry, they moan, they can no longer handle the slave labor. We as human beings have the ability to tolerate many things if we know that it's temporary, that there'll be a change, that there'll be a light at the end of the tunnel. There will be a sof. They see there is no sof, no light at the end of the tunnel. So what do? You know what they do? They give up all hope. And they realize one thing. There's only one place we can turn. It's not in the human hands. It's not in a new administration. It's only the Ribono Shel Vayizaku, they cry out. They plead with God. Vatal shavasam el Elokim. And what do the next verses say? After God hears their crying, their moaning, their suffering. After they turn to God. God turns to the CEO of Yisro's cattle business in the famous event of the Sneh. What happens? Very, very strange event. The Midrash, if you look at the Midrashim, the Otzer Midrashim quotes from the Tanchuma, from the Medrash Haggadol, the Medrash Rabbah, from multiple sources. This whole image of the Sneh, what is this? If you were Cecil B. DeMille, and it was your film that you were making, God would not appear to Moshe in tumbleweed, in a thicket and thorn bush. That's not the way the Ribono Shel Olam would appear to Moshe. That's not how we're going to start out the Geula. But that's what the Ribono Shel Olam does. And why did the Ribono Shel Olam convey the message and appear to Moshe in this guise? And there's some profound insights. One we're going to quote from the Rav Zatzal. And that is the following. First of all, just to be aware, the image we have of the Sneh is really, it's it's an incorrect image. It's not like the Sneh is on fire burning and, but the wood or the thicket of the Sneh doesn't get consumed. That's not exactly what happens. What happens exactly? The Sneh, the tumbleweed, as you know, is on the perimeter. And there's a vacuum in the middle. There's a fire bilabas eish. Where is the fire? It's not burning the thicket. It's contained in the cavity. It's contained in the center, in balabat, the lave, the heart or the center of the tumbleweed. And Moshe is bothered. What does Moshe say? Madua lo yivar hasneh. Look at that grammar of lo yivar hasneh. How come you know the laws of physics? In order for fire to function, fire's got to have fuel to burn. Fire will go out if there's nothing for it to consume or to burn or to eat. So what happens? The fire has nothing to consume. It's pure air, it's pure gulf, it's pure vacuum. And it's contained in the middle of the thicket, in the middle of the tumbleweed. How do you have this? How do you have this? That's what he's bothered by. How come the fire has not spread to the tumbleweed? How come it hasn't spread to the thorns or to the thicket? That's what he's bothered by. In the message that the Ribono Shel Olam is giving, this Mare Hagadol, it's a strange sight in terms of defying the laws of physics, but it's also a new insight. It's strange in terms of what Moshe's assumptions were about the Jewish people. So God appears, Imo Anochi B'tzara. He appears to the Jewish people in their state of crisis. Imo Anochi B'tzara. Not in the great cedars of Lebanon, not in a great oak or maple tree, but where? In something that's worthless, that's rubbish. You can't use it for furniture. It doesn't produce beautiful flowers. It doesn't produce, sumptuous fruit. It's not something that can even be used as firewood. It has no value. Moshe, you saw the Jewish people as tumbleweed, is a bunch of thorns, something worthless that doesn't produce wood, doesn't produce firewood, doesn't illuminate, doesn't produce fruit or flowers. That's what you saw. So God says to Moshe Rabbenu, Ra'o Ra'isi. What's the double language Ra'o Ra'isi? I see something deeper than what you see. You only saw them in a one-dimensional sense. A bunch of factious, cantankerous, wretched slaves that ratted you out. That's what you saw. But Moshe, look deeper. Ra'o Ra'isi. There's a different level that you have to look at. And that's beneath the surface. That's beneath the external, rough layer. There's a fire. There's a fire that burns within. It hasn't come to the surface yet, but it's there. Fire that illuminates. Fire that generates heat, that gives off heat. It's there. It's contained, bilabat, in the heart. That's where the fire is. Moshe, look deeper. Lo kemoshe ata ro'eh ani ro'eh. Not what you see, Moshe, do I see. I see a little deeper. And you can engage that warmth. You can engage that fire that still is there. They're not dried up. To quote the Rav, they haven't become avdei Pharaoh. Avadim hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. Yes, economically, they're slaves. Yes, when you look at them, they have a rough exterior. But internally, they have not become Pharaoh's slaves. Internally, there's still a fire that burns. It's encapsulated. It's enclosed. But it's there. And you can extrapolate it. You can bring it out. You can bring it to the surface. Only you, Moshe. That's why I'm choosing you. You're not Abba Eben. You may not be the world's greatest diplomat. But as a teacher, as a mentor, Moshe Rabbenu, you are the teacher, you're the mentor par excellence. And you can transform this group of illiterate pagan slaves into the Dordeya. You can transform them into a people of knowledge, of substance, of greatness. They have the potential. I need you to bring it out. And they debate back and forth, back and forth. And Moshe doesn't want to go back. He's had terrible experiences, as we articulated. But Hashem demands that of him. And once Moshe accepts to be that, the mentor, the teacher, the one who can redeem them, not only physically, juridically from the state of slavery, but to redeem them spiritually. Geula has the implication of psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually. Once Moshe takes on that task, that role, and he's willing to acknowledge that there's a fire that burns within, and he's willing to bring that fire to the surface, to the fore, then the redemption starts. Then the Geula starts. And that's the important experience of the Sneh, and why the Ribono Sh'Olam appears in that guise to Moshe Rabbenu. Moshe goes on through his experiences at Har Sinai, through his experiences of being the great defender of the Jewish people, to become the world's most perfected human being. We know it's an axiom, it's an essential postulate of our theology, that after Moshe, ein navi rashai l'chadish davar. No prophet before, no prophet after can change, can give insight, can add, can subtract to Torah's Moshe. He was the most perfected human being. His relationship with God was the most perfected that any human being before or after ever had. And he emerges and he develops into that. It's a function of his nature, of how God created him, in terms of his IQ, in terms of his biochemical makeup. It's a function of his nurture, in terms of these people who had an impact on him, his stepmother, his mother and father, his sister. It's a function of his experiences, the Ibn Ezra says, growing up in the royal court. And it's a function of training in Kush. And ultimately, the Medrash says that you're tested by Dvarim Ketanim. To see whether you are a great person, very often, the litmus test is not this great event where you're standing there and the lights and the camera are focused on you and you're doing it in front of the people in the bleachers. No, sometimes it's a very small thing. The little Shepsela gets lost. The notion of leaving the royal palace and seeing Nebuch, looking after the plight of these people. No one knows that you're there, no one knows that you're doing it. And when Vayifen ko vako, and he looked with all the justifications and rationalizations, all the reasons he had to excuse himself from acting, he sacrificed everything. He sacrificed his political position. He sacrificed what would be almost his life. To what? To take care of a person who, in the eyes of the world, accounted for nothing, whom he never met before, will never meet afterwards. This is the great man. This is the great Moshe Rabbenu, who ultimately, as we study throughout the Chumash, will become the world's most perfected man. The greatest mentor, the greatest teacher, greatest leader, and ultimately the most perfected human being. What made Moshe into Moshe? So in the last brief half hour, 40 minutes, we've looked at some of the factors that contributed to the emergence of the most perfected human being on the face of the earth. Thank you.